The story of David and Goliath is perhaps one of the best known in history. A banger from the book of Samuel, it tells the tale of a young farmhand with the approximate build of a Pringle who successfully defeats, in single combat, Goliath, the most feared warrior of Mesopotamia and a man bigger than your average branch of IKEA. David, in doing so, saves his people. The story has since passed into cliché and has become modern shorthand for, well, didn't see that one coming. In fact, if I say the names twice more, forget every member of the Uruguay squad and, maybe suggest you never know which French team's going to turn up, I think I automatically get installed as a pundit on Tier 2 games in the next World Cup. David is the ultimate underdog, and Goliath is the heaviest of favourites. On paper, there's only one possible winner. It's like Brian Habana losing a race to a loaf of bread. It was a decided outcome that somehow went the other way. And no story in rugby, and very few in all of sport, fits the David against Goliath billing better than Japan against South Africa in the 2015 Rugby World Cup. Simply put, the match now known as the Brighton Miracle was the biggest upset in rugby union history. As Joel Stransky said on Full Time, it might be the biggest upset in all of professional sports. And even beside the final result, it was a proper thriller, a fascinating match as two mismatched teams scored plenty of points in the game that came down to the final seconds. So, how did Japan beat the Springboks and turn the rugby world on its head? Because of Japan's progress since, it's actually become quite hard to remember just how huge an upset this was. Going into the game, Japan had not won a Rugby World Cup match in 24 years. Despite qualifying for every World Cup to date, Japan had only ever won one match, a 1991 52-8 blowout over Zimbabwe. To put that result in context, Zimbabwe have qualified for 2 World Cups, but across those, never won a game, and only ever conceded fewer than 50 points once. Beating teams like Zimbabwe was Japan's level. They were better than the rest, but nowhere near the big boys at the World Cup itself. Every 4 years, they cantered through Asian qualifying, putting 60 past the likes of Hong Kong, then arrived in the host nation to be cantered through themselves. Their record in the 24 years between wins, 18 played, 16 lost, with their best result being 2 dramatic draws with Canada, both coming down to kicks in the 79th minute. The aggregate score? 303 points for, 949 points against. People loved watching Japan because they were fun. A team who had incredible skills but no expectation of ever winning, so they were willing to take risks. Japan were admired for their willingness to run from anywhere and their long tradition of great, intricate set moves. Look at this kind of shit. Look at this. This is great. You can't help but love these guys. How much fun is this? I mean, they also did, there's, in amongst that, there's a load of this, and some of this, occasionally they let the opposition do that, or this, or this as well. But, who cares if you're losing 70-18 if the 18 points you score are all such beauties? I'm going to babble on a bit here to fill in some time because I want to play this try and full without needing to put it at like 46 times speed. Look, I don't care that it's against Wales. In fact, I'm quite delighted it's against Wales because it shows I'm just not bad. Rugby, really, so rugby. Japan were well liked for the way they played the game, but at the cost of never being respected for what they achieved playing it. The Springboks, on the other hand, were outright feared. They were then, and indeed now are once again, the most successful side in the history of the competition. After not taking part in the first 2 tournaments, South Africa won the World Cup in 1995 and then won the World Cup in 2007 and have never failed to make the knockouts, with the 2011 quarter-final loss to Bryce Lawrence and David Pocock being the only time they've ever lost a World Cup match against anyone other than the All Blacks or that year's eventual champion. And this was a good South African side. The previous year, they defeated 2015's eventual champions, New Zealand, in a full-blooded test match. 19 of the 23 players who faced Japan, 13 of the starting 15, have won a World Cup. The starting 15 boasted 851 caps between them, a record at the time. Goliath might have been big, but I wager not even he could take on Tendam Taui or the Duplessis brothers in a scrap. This South African team was talented, it was well coached, it was smart, it was experienced, and it was bloody enormous. Because this match was not supposed to even be a contest, it was a procession. Japan would score a couple of nice tries and roll over and die by the 60-minute mark. That's what they did, and the Springboks would win. That's what they did. They bullied you and battered you until the scoreboard reflected that. In their 124-year history, the Springboks had played a Tier 2 nation on 42 occasions. They had won on all 42. And in only one of those games had the opposition ever finished within one score, within 7 points. And this isn't an isolated example. Between the game turning professional and kick-off in Brighton, there'd been 101 Rugby World Cup matches where one nation was designated Tier 1 and the other designated Tier 2. Of those 101, the Tier 1 team won 97 times. 3 of those 4 underdog wins were by Pacific Island sides, stacked with players playing professionally across Europe over a faltering Wales or France. Historically, the 2 most mentally fragile Tier 1 nations. And the other was Argentina, prior to moving up the tiers, beating Ireland in the 1999 quarter-final playoff, hence serving as the exceptions that prove the rule. You either need a rugby-rich culture and professionalism and resources of the big boys on your side, or you need to be playing Ireland when the match label includes the words quarter-final. Japan fitted none of this criteria. 28 of their 31 players were locally based, a number of them also holding down part-time jobs. They didn't come from a country where rugby was in the blood, and they didn't wear the light blue hoops that bring out all Irishmen in a rash. They were no hopers. They were a novelty act, turning up to make everyone swoon over a fancy winger, then they'll, trundle back home. So, 2011. Things go as par, as you'd expect. Japan have some fun against France, they score a try against the All Blacks, then they head home without a win, despite being drawn with a very beatable Canada and Tonga. Coach John Kirwan goes, and instead comes a man who no longer needs any introduction, Eddie Jones. About 6 months into the job, Eddie Jones went on a remarkable rant to the Japanese press as he named his squad for the 2012 Autumn Internationals. Japanese rugby, Jones said, was stuck in the 1950s. He refused to pick any players from the university programme on principle. The first time this had happened as far back as anyone could find, as far back as there were really records of Japan squads, as he felt it simply wasn't producing players cut out for Test rugby. In fact, he went further and coined a phrase he'll come back to a few years down the line. What universities in Japan were playing just wasn't rugby. You need to see the attitude. Jones said, according to a transcript that can't possibly be correct because it doesn't include the word mate once, of, "I'm going to smash him if you want to make your mark in the rugby world. The only player we have who does that is Kikatani," referring to then captain, back row forward Takeshi Kikatani. Basically, Eddie Jones was saying, 33 of my 34-man squad are shit. On top of this, Japan had to overcome another natural disadvantage. They're the national team of one of the few countries on earth where Cheslin Colbeck could get on all the rides at Disneyland. Being in Japan for the World Cup was the only time in my life I felt quite tall. It sounds awful and xenophobic, but it's one Jones made himself. The Japanese are naturally quite uniformly small people, and they were due to face a nation famous for producing men big enough to rise out of the Pacific Ocean and terrify everyone. Kirwan had tried to overcome this by bringing in South Sea Islanders to qualifying residency, but it resulted in a disjointed team that was still being blown apart by larger packs. And yet, Jones was very clear in his aims. From several years out, he openly said he wanted to make the quarterfinals of a World Cup, minimum. And to do that, his most important job was to wrestle them out of the mindset of a side who lost 83-7 to the All Blacks, but were delighted at the result because they got a try. Now, as we've seen since he took that much higher profile job with England...
It's hard when you don't play rugby.
So it wasn't a game of rugby?
Because you're not playing rugby.
That's not rugby.
There's no performance because we didn't play rugby.
Because there wasn't any rugby today.
It wasn't rugby.
Because we didn't play rugby.
Look, he had a terrible day because he wasn't refereeing rugby and he's a rugby referee. I don't know what it is, but it's not rugby.
It ceased to be a game of rugby, and we practiced for a game of rugby all week and we didn't get it.
And it wasn't rugby, so we haven't played a game of rugby yet.
Because we haven't played rugby yet.
It wasn't rugby. Let's be serious. It wasn't rugby today.
Eddie Jones loves to repeat himself. This isn't a tick or a stutter, however. It's a core part of his approach to coaching. The Eddie Jones angle is you want to build your players up to a point at which they no longer need you. They know their systems inside out and they're now smart enough to fix any issues with it themselves, and hopefully do so on the fly. And in order to drill this down into a player's skull, he looks to make any messages as simple as possible and then to repeat them. Eddie Jones's job is to look at whatever's going wrong with his team, get it down to its most basic form, and then just say it over and over and over and over and over and over and over again until it seeps in and becomes second nature. Perhaps the most important of these phrases was by far the simplest. He said this a lot. He wanted to create a new Japanese style of rugby. Rugby in the professional era changes so rapidly. Innovations come in and are exposed and replaced before most fans have even had a chance to notice they exist. As such, smaller sides are always just trying to keep up, to copy the big boys. This has traditionally been Italy's problem in the Six Nations. They're usually a year behind the other teams. Kirwan's approach had been to try and keep up, to copy, and to his credit, his Japan side weren't enormously behind the big teams. However, even if his Japan side were to play the exact innovations of the Springboks, they were going to lose. If two teams played with the same tactics, you're good as playing the game on paper. And that first fixture in Brighton was a match, as we've established, Japan could never win on paper. So this was a trap Eddie Jones had to learn to avoid. An avid reader, during his first year in charge of Japan, he read a book by Malcolm Gladwell entitled, funnily enough, David and Goliath. It's a close analysis of underdog victories in everything from basketball to education to academia, and something he cites as a huge inspiration. The book's called Thesis, and this is a quote, it's on page 25, if anyone wants to read it. I enjoyed it, We have a very limited and rigid understanding of what an advantage is. David had as much chance of beating Goliath in a fistfight as I would of beating Mamuka Godze in a bear eating contest. So instead, he slayed him by slinging a chunky rock square at his forehead. Scientists now estimate David could probably throw that rock at around 34 meters per second. In stopping power, that makes the rock David threw at Goliath equivalent to a modern handgun. The rules only state that David had to face Goliath one-on-one. They never said he had to fight him hand-to-hand. And they certainly never said he couldn't lob a pebble with such velocity it pierced Goliath's skull. This is what Eddie Jones took from the book. In order for an underdog to win, they have to shift the idea of advantage. They have to change the way the war is fought. Gladwell notes an underdog's chance of victory increases 36% if they adopt a different underhand strategy. David wasn't good at much, but he was world class at chucking stones at people's faces, and that was what saw him to victory. It was up to Jones to find whatever the equivalent was for Japan, and to use those key strengths to invent his new Japanese style of rugby. So what were these strengths? As a race of smaller people, they couldn't physically dominate in the way England or South Africa might like to. Many in rugby, particularly in 2011-15 era of wingers the size of food trucks, saw that as a disadvantage. Eddie Jones saw it as a strength. With smaller size came increased manoeuvrability, fitness, speed, dynamism. Smaller players tend to be more skillful from an early age, as they've never been able to rely on physical gifts. Japan's strengths were everything but their strength. So the Blossoms would build a game plan on this. Eddie Jones had a roadmap, a plan, and an idea right from the beginning, and the intention was always to refine it as he went on, but the essence was to move an opposition, to force the defence to shuffle and shake until gaps opened themselves up. Just to explain what I mean, let's look at Japan's 2 tries from their first win over a Tier 1 nation, their 2013 beating of Wales, because, we Welsh were losing to the Blossoms way before it was cool. To watch the 2 finishes in slow motion, it wouldn't look it, but these 2 tries are virtually identical from a process and analysis standpoint. Japan set their right wing and a man called wing tied to the scrum. Now, the Welsh defence is led by the first man, but characterised by an aggressive push from the 13 channel. And so, Japan's attack is focused on taking out the 2 main defensive decision makers. From the scrum, number 8 Hikitani spins off the base himself to Hirose, who carries straight, flat, into that first man. Because he wasn't required at the base, this allows scrum half, Fumiaki Tanaka, to be at the breakdown ready to whip the ball away before it's even available, and in turn, because they know just how fast Fumi will be, Japan only need to commit minimal bodies to the ruck, allowing their players to instead set shape. However, the really interesting shape is Welsh. By playing with such pace, Japan contracted the Welsh line incredibly quickly. It's suddenly narrow, drawn in. Fly half Tatakawa fires the ball on just as quickly as Tanaka, bringing the other centre, Male Sao, onto the ball, who notices Patchell, playing in the centres, drifting to accommodate for the narrowness. Sao splits the 2 centres and crosses the gain line, but more importantly, hits the second pillar of the Welsh defence. By targeting both decision makers so hard and so quickly, Japan have completely disabled the Shaun Edwards press in just 8 seconds. Now, I'm going to rewind. From the initial scrum, Michael Leach begins working right from one side of the pitch to the other, hidden behind the play. The Welsh haven't noticed, but Japan have managed to sneak one of their 2 big ball carriers onto the blind side and lined him up against a fly half and a 13-stone winger. This has 2 effects. One, yes, it keeps Japan going forward, but it also keeps the Welsh pack working. Look at how much distance they have to cover to defend tight to 3 rucks in 3 very different locations in quick succession. Tanaka then successively hits forward carriers stood in between the Welsh defence's final forward and their first back, the point at which the defence transitions from a push to a rush. Again, by hitting this so hard and so fast, it prevents that transition. The Welsh defence can only ready itself, it can't be actively aggressive, and a few phases later, it's that space that eventually makes the difference. The defence is pulled so far out of shape over those phases, loose head reskill is now lingering way out, and Japan sends centre wing, at the transition gap, as I'm going to call it, He sneaks through, he scores a try. I'm never doing that again. It's exactly the same idea on their other try. Phase after phase after phase into that transition gap incredibly quickly and very, very composed. Here, Tatekawa is stood around the gap, but the Welsh defence drifts, somewhat wise to the trick. They can't close the gap, but they can move it. Instead, Tatekawa invites a forward into the new gap, then, following phase, is happy to take a crash ball pass off Hirose to hit it himself. Each phase, Japan pull Wales inwards and out of shape a little bit more, and it allows Tanaka to throw this brilliant pass and for Sal to put Broadhurst in the corner. By using the speed and dynamism granted by the smaller size and by doing the homework, by knowing their opposition, Japan completely disabled a world-class defence and saw themselves to a famous victory, albeit famous now in the kind of way Russ Abbott is famous when put next to Paul McCartney's, Michelle Obama's and Tom Cruise's they pulled off since. This didn't click right away. During Jones's first year in charge, he spoke of how players were enamoured by the Kiwi style of rugby and reluctant to jump ship to something new, but instead copy the most successful brand of rugby in the world at the time. So he went in hard. After losing their first 2 games, Jones banned kicking. Players could only kick if they stood behind their own try line, and even then, they were encouraged to look wide first. They had to get used to the structures by any means necessary, no matter how radical. If the system was going to work, the players had to believe in it, and it wasn't until Japan were willing to pull set moves like this in their own 22, and it wasn't until, anyway, they were doing this, that Jones lifted the kicking ban. Players were making calls based on initiative, not what they'd seen the All Blacks doing on the telly. However, this proved to be the easy part. The style started to click, but that was the extent of it. After a 2012 loss to the French Barbarians, a scratch side who'd done more downing than training during the week, Jones went on a fully fledged rant once again. The players just don't want to win enough, mate, he told the press. This had to change, and it would take the full 3 remaining years to do so. In Jones' own words, Japanese players are educated to be obedient, to the extent at which he spoke of players ignoring 5-man overlaps because he told them to attack the 10 channel. To a certain extent, Eddie would use this. A new training regime was put in place. 5 a.m. rowing, cycling, 10 a.m. weights, 2 p.m. unit training, 6 p.m. team training. He named this training program Beat the Box. Michael Leach went on to say he honestly felt no other team at the World Cup could have worked harder than them, and all this work would only feel worth it if they won. It took hours of attrition, but eventually Jones broke through. By using the national addiction to hard work, he managed to create an environment in which losing would not do. This was still only half the battle because the Japanese attitude did not fit with the Eddie Jones approach to coaching at all. Whilst Jones is very fond of a preordained multi-phase move, his philosophy is that the coach should aim to make themselves irrelevant, whereas Japanese culture is, and again I apologise for being a white guy leaning on cultural stereotypes, but this is all coming from things people said when researching, talking about the rugby. But yeah, Japanese culture built around looking up to a boss figure. Jones looked to tackle this by coining a second key phrase he would repeat over and over and over again. Rugby is a game of communication. He encouraged the team to chat, to natter, to gossip, chew the fat, to twaddle, pow, babble, prattle, slabber and yak. And not just his team. After his initial rant, Jones began taking training sessions at universities and local sides, and it was on him to raise standards nationwide. And in every session, communication was the core focus. Because in order to play the way he intended, he had to turn the team into a side with 15 capable decision makers. Part of that could be built in training. Once a week, Jones would schedule a 30-minute fully opposed session, at which every play had to take place 30 to 40% quicker than it would in a match. They had seconds to set a line out, no time at all to take a conversion. The ball had to be out of the ruck as quickly as possible, that kind of thing. The idea being, if players get used to playing that quickly, and with that level of fatigue in their bodies, the standard and speed of a normal game should be manageable. However, training is one thing. He had to make sure they could do so under pressure with an opposition out for blood. Eddie Jones's first Japan side had a grand total of 302 caps between its 34 players, with more than a third of them belonging to just 2 individuals in Lock Firefighter Hero Hitoshi Ono and Bundle of Joy Fumiaki Tanaka. For no comparison, the Springboks squad who rocked up in England had 1,318 caps between their 31 players. So, in late 2012, the end of his first year in charge, Jones stated in order to compete at the World Cup, his starting 15 would need a total of 500 to 550 caps between them. The talent and training would count for nothing if these players weren't hardened in battle. This meant he had to identify his strongest side early so he could blood them properly. In order to make a quarter-final, Japan would need a team of players who'd been playing test match rugby for several years, who'd been around the block. To key in on just how he achieved this, let's look at the backs. In the year following his last rant, Jones selected a total of 16 players to fill the 7 backs positions. 2 of them he clearly identified as not being up to scratch and scrapped after 1 start each, never to play for Japan again. This then left him with a core squad of 14 backs. Between that moment and the Rugby World Cup, Jones selected only 4 players outside that 14. One of them made just 2 appearances off the bench, but the other 3 were pretty extraordinary. We're talking generational talent Kotaro Mashishima, key cog in the 2019 machine Ryota Nakamura, and eternal pub quiz question Khan Hesketh. To give a random comparison, in the time frame where Jones chose from 18 backs, Wales selected 32, England selected 34, and France selected 26 in 2013 alone. To hone in even closer, between the bench and starting spots, there were 46 opportunities to blood a fly half against a nation that had qualified for a World Cup over Jones' tenure. And one of the trio Japan eventually took to that World Cup, Koseono Utamura or Haramichi Tatakawa, took up 43. Likewise, Jones only started 3 scrum halves across his entire tenure. Dead set from the beginning that Tanaka, Uchada and Hawasa were his trio, and he had to get them playing to as high a standard as possible. There was no point wasting crucial minutes on players who weren't up to snuff. Jones gave his squad maximum opportunity to get used to the standard of Test rugby, to learn to execute his game plan and how to make decisions under pressure. And so, when they arrived in Brighton, his 15 against South Africa exceeded his target of 500 to 550 caps, clocking in at exactly 600 with another 210 on the bench. These shifts in mindset and growth in experience put Japan into perhaps the most cohesive, unified team at the World Cup, and it began to pump a confidence through them. Look at Tanaka and Yoshi Fujita, jibber-jabbering about the team's ambitions here in 2014.
Our aim will be to win 3 games in the group stage and to qualify for the quarter-finals. I think we have some very tough games, especially against Samoa and Scotland, but I believe we have a great chance to beat them.
We're aiming to make it to the quarter-finals. Japan has never won a World Cup, and it is time for us to change that and create a new history for Japan rugby. Ideally, we would love to get into the semi-finals.
Remember, this is a side who hadn't won a Rugby World Cup match in 24 years. Neither of these players would ever have seen them do so live. And their coach, just 14 months earlier, had accused them of not having the ambition to win. But thanks to Jones's regime, they now had the mindset, the fitness and the game plan of a Tier 1 nation. So, after 3 years of prep and an endless summer of training, Japan were finally ready for the 2015 Rugby World Cup. Join me next week when I'll dive into the game itself and just how David was able to slay Goliath.
How are you fitting in?
Very hard.
It's very hard?
Yeah, but
What's hard for me?
language?
Language?
Yeah, because everybody speaks Japanese.
Yes.
So I can't speak Japanese.
Oh.
I can speak just only English.
Okay, so whereabouts are you from, Vimy?
Sorry?
Whereabouts are you from?
New Zealand.
You're from New Zealand?
Yeah.
Are you Kiwi?
Yeah.
Good on you.
Yeah. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu.